Not for poor performance, not for misconduct, not for anything I did wrong. I was let go after 19 years because my boss's nephew needed somewhere to sit. I want you to let that sink in for a second. 19 years. I started at that company when my oldest son was still in diapers. I built the entire Midwest sales division from 4 accounts to 63. I flew to client dinners on Christmas Eve. I took calls at my father's funeral. I gave that company everything a person can give, and on a Tuesday morning in March, the new CFO's nephew walked into my office, sat down across from me, and told me my services were no longer required. His name was Derek, 26 years old, finance degree from a school I'd never heard of. The only thing he'd ever sold in his life was his old video game console on eBay, and he was about to take over my territory. I'm Marcus. I'm 51 years old. For nearly 2 decades, I was the regional director of business development at a mid-sized medical device company based out of Chicago. We sold surgical equipment, the kind that ends up in operating rooms at major hospital systems. Not a glamorous business to explain at dinner parties, but an important one, and a relationship-driven one. The kind of business where trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. That's the part Derek's uncle never understood, and it's the part that matters most to everything I'm about to tell you. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with the firing. It starts about 8 months before, when our longtime CFO, a man named Richard, announced his retirement. Richard had been with the company for 22 years. He was steady, careful, old school, the kind of executive who read every contract himself and never made a decision without sleeping on it. I liked Richard. More importantly, I trusted him. The man they brought in to replace him was named Gary. Gary came from a private equity background, which should have been the first warning sign. Private equity people see companies as spreadsheets, not as collections of human relationships. Gary was 54, fit, well-dressed, and he smiled constantly in a way that never quite reached his eyes. He was brought in specifically to optimize operations, which in corporate language usually means cut things and hope nobody notices until after bonus season. I introduced myself to Gary in his first week. I walked him through the Midwest numbers. I showed him the growth curve over a decade and a half. He nodded, said all the right things, called our client relationships a genuine competitive asset. I left that meeting feeling okay about him. Not great, but okay. I should have trusted my gut. About 3 months after Gary arrived, I started noticing things. Small things at first. I'd be left off meeting invites I was always included in before. My quarterly reports, which used to go straight to the CEO, started getting rerouted through Gary's office first. A reorganization memo went out that changed 3 reporting structures without anyone consulting me, even though 2 of those changes directly affected my team. Then Derek appeared. He was introduced at an all-hands as Gary's nephew. Gary actually used the word nephew, out loud, in front of 200 employees, without a trace of embarrassment, and his title was Strategic Development Associate. Nobody knew what that meant, including, I suspect, Derek. For the first month, he shadowed me. Gary had framed it as an onboarding rotation, which was reasonable enough on its surface. I brought Derek to client visits. I walked him through our pipeline. I explained the dynamics of each major hospital system, the personalities of the procurement leads, the unwritten rules of how deals actually get done in this industry. I did it professionally and thoroughly, because that's who I am. I treated him the way I'd want to be treated. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that I was training my own replacement. The first direct sign came in February. I had a major contract renewal coming up with a hospital network called Meridian Health. Meridian was our single largest account. They operated 11 hospitals across 4 states and had been a client for 12 years. The relationship was mine. I had personally managed it since the beginning, through 3 different procurement directors and 2 ownership changes on their side. Renewing Meridian wasn't just routine business. It was the kind of thing that, in our industry, you don't leave to chance or to people who don't know the history. Gary called me into his office and told me Derek would be leading the Meridian renewal. I kept my voice level. I asked him to explain the reasoning. He said it was a developmental opportunity for Derek, and that he had full confidence in my ability to support the process. Support. After 12 years and 3 ownership transitions, I was being asked to support a 26-year-old who'd been in the building for 30 days. I told Gary, calmly and professionally, that I had concerns. That Meridian's current procurement director, a man named Tom, had a specific relationship with me, and that changing the lead contact on a renewal of this size carried real risk. Gary listened to everything I said, and then told me the decision had already been made. I walked out of that office and called Tom at Meridian directly. Not to complain, Not to cause problems, just to give him a heads up that Derek would be his primary contact going forward, and to let him know I'd still be available if he ever needed to reach me. Tom went quiet on the phone for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus, I don't love that." I told him I understood. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched Derek handle the Meridian renewal from the sidelines. He was late to a call. He mixed up the names of 2 of their facilities in an email. He used the wrong pricing tier in the initial proposal, not slightly wrong. Wrong by a margin that would have cost us roughly $340,000 in annual revenue if Tom hadn't flagged it himself. Tom flagged it because Tom was professional, and because Tom had been doing this long enough to know something was off. But Tom also started CCing me on emails. Little things, here and there, nothing dramatic, just a quiet signal that he was keeping a thread open. The renewal closed, barely, and at terms worse than what we'd held for the previous cycle. Gary declared it a success in the next all-hands meeting, and thanked Derek by name. I said nothing. By early March, I knew something was coming. The meeting invites had dried up almost completely. Gary had started holding one-on-ones with my direct reports, not through me, directly, without telling me. 2 members of my team separately asked me what was happening, and I told them honestly that I didn't know, but that they should focus on their work and keep doing what they were doing. On March 14th, a Thursday, Gary's assistant sent me a calendar invite for a meeting the following Tuesday at 9 a.m. No subject line, no attendees listed beyond the 2 of us. I've been in the corporate world long enough to know what that kind of meeting looks like. I spent that weekend getting my affairs in order, not in a panicked way, in a methodical way. I reviewed my employment agreement. I looked at what I was owed in unvested compensation. I made a mental note of every commitment the company had made to me in writing and every commitment I had made to them. I was not going to walk into that room unprepared. Tuesday morning, I sat down across from Gary. He had a manila folder on the desk in front of him. He opened it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, which he probably had, given where he came from. He told me the company was going in a new direction, that my role was being eliminated, that they appreciated my years of contribution. I asked him to be specific about what new direction meant. He said the Midwest territory was being restructured, and that Derek would be assuming regional responsibility going forward. I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment. 19 years. 63 accounts, a sales division I'd built with my own hands. And the reason it was being taken from me was sitting in the next building over, probably answering emails he didn't fully understand. I asked Gary one question. I said, "Is this a performance-based termination?" He said it was a structural decision. I said, "I'd like that in writing." He slid the folder across to me. Severance terms. A non-disclosure agreement. A non-compete clause that covered a geographic radius and a time window I found deeply unreasonable given that this was not a performance termination. I read every line. Gary sat across from me with his hands folded, waiting. Here's what I want to pause on for a moment, because this is the part of the story that matters beyond just what happened to me. The documents in front of me were written to protect the company, not me. The non-compete was structured to prevent me from working with any of my existing accounts for 18 months. The NDA included language broad enough that I couldn't discuss the circumstances of my departure with anyone, including, arguably, a future employer asking why I left. I've talked to a lot of people over the years who've been in situations like this, and the instinct in that moment is to sign. You're rattled. You want the severance. You don't want to fight. You tell yourself it'll be fine. I want to be clear. I'm not a lawyer, and nothing I'm saying here is legal advice. But what I will tell you is that before I signed anything, I exercised my right to take the documents home and have my own attorney review them. Gary told me the offer had a 5-day window. I told him I understood. My attorney, a woman I'd used for real estate transactions and never expected to need for something like this, reviewed both documents. She came back with 7 specific issues, including the geographic scope of the non-compete and a clause in the NDA that she said was almost certainly unenforceable, but was written to scare me anyway. We sent back a counteroffer. Gary came back. We went 2 rounds. In the end, I signed a version of the severance agreement and a narrowed NDA, and I did not sign the non-compete. They dropped it rather than litigate, which told me everything I needed to know about how solid it was to begin with. I cleaned out my office on a Friday afternoon. I said goodbye to the people I cared about. I drove home, sat in my driveway for about 10 minutes, and then I went inside and told my wife what had happened. She already knew something was wrong. She'd known for weeks. She handed me a cup of coffee and said, "So what are you going to do?" I told her I was going to build something. Here's the thing about 19 years in a relationship-driven industry. The company owned the contracts. They did not own the relationships. Those belong to the people who built them, and those people are human beings who make choices. I was careful. I was precise. I did not reach out to a single client while I was still bound by any transition obligations. I waited. I talked to my attorney again. I made sure I understood exactly what I could and could not do and when. And then, 43 days after my last day, I registered a business. I called it Bridgeway Medical Partners. A simple name. Nothing flashy. And I started making phone calls. I want to tell you about the first call I made, because it still means something to me. Tom at Meridian picked up on the second ring. I told him what I was doing. I told him I'd started my own firm, that I had relationships with 3 device manufacturers that I believed could serve Meridian at a competitive level, and that I wasn't calling to pressure him. I was calling because he deserved to hear it from me directly, and because after 12 years, I owed him that conversation. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus, I was wondering when you were going to call." He brought us in for a meeting the following week. I'm not going to tell you every call went exactly like that, because they didn't. Some people weren't in a position to move. Some had just renewed and couldn't make a change for a year or more. Some took weeks to respond. I understood all of that. I didn't push, and I didn't make anyone feel obligated. But within 90 days, 14 of my former accounts had signed letters of intent with Bridgeway. Within 6 months, that number was 21. At the point I'm describing now, we work with 26 accounts, including Meridian. The total annual value of those relationships is more than 4 times what I was earning as a salaried employee. I want to take a step back here because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, what about Derek? What happened at the old company? And I'll tell you not because I take pleasure in it, but because it's part of the story, and because it illustrates something important. I heard things secondhand, the way you do. I didn't go looking for information, but people talk, especially in an industry where everyone knows everyone. Derek lost 2 major accounts in his first quarter. One of them was a hospital system called Ascend Regional, a relationship I had personally managed for 11 years. From what I was told, Derek showed up to their annual review meeting without having read the previous year's performance summary. The procurement lead, a woman named Patricia, who I have enormous respect for, ended the meeting early and sent an email to Gary the same day. Ascend moved their business 3 months later. The second account lost was smaller, but the manner of it was worse. A billing dispute that had been handled informally for years, the kind of thing that works when there's trust and breaks down when there isn't, escalated into a formal complaint when Derek responded to an email from the wrong account and accidentally copied a competitor's contact information into a client message. It sounds almost too absurd to be real. I assure you it is real. Gary, to his credit or discredit depending on how you look at it, did not make any public acknowledgement that anything was wrong. He issued an internal memo about adjusting to market conditions in Q2 and reorganized 2 reporting lines. But the numbers told their own story. And in a company our size, the numbers are visible to enough people that you can't hide them forever. By the end of Q3, about 7 months after my termination, the company had lost 4 of its top 12 accounts. The CEO, a man named Warren, who had been largely absent during all of this, and whom I'd always found decent, if not particularly engaged, finally got involved. Gary was out by October. The company brought in an outside consultant to assess the damage. I heard from Warren personally, actually. He called me in November. It was a short conversation. He asked if I had any interest in discussing a return in some capacity. I thanked him for calling, and I told him that I'd built something I was proud of, and that I wasn't in a position to walk away from the people who'd trusted me to show up for them. He said he understood. It was a respectful conversation. I don't feel anger when I think about any of this. I want to be honest with you about that. There was a period, maybe 6 or 8 weeks after the termination, where I felt something close to rage, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that sits in your chest when you're trying to go to sleep. The kind that comes from watching someone dismantle something you spent years building and pretend they know what they're doing. But that passed. And what replaced it was something cleaner. There's a version of this story where I'm the hero and Gary and Derek are the villains. That version is simpler and probably more satisfying for about 5 minutes. The more honest version is that Gary made a decision driven by nepotism and short-term thinking. Derek was a young guy who got put in a position he wasn't ready for and paid a professional price for it, and I was in the right place to make the most of something painful. Nobody is entirely a villain. Nobody is entirely a victim. The market just told the truth, the way markets eventually do. What I actually want you to take from this story, if you're sitting somewhere right now feeling like the rug got pulled out from under you, or like you watch someone less qualified get the thing you spent years earning, is this: the relationships you build with integrity are yours, not the company's. Not your titles, yours. They travel with you. They answer the phone when you call. They take the meeting because they want to, not because they're obligated to. And the second thing, do not sign anything you haven't read. I know that sounds obvious. I know you've heard it before. But in that moment, in that office, with the folder on the desk and the clock ticking, the pressure to just sign and be done is enormous. Take the documents home. Call a lawyer. Even if it costs you a few $100s, it is worth every cent. The third thing, and maybe the most important, the window between losing something and building something new is uncomfortable in a way that's hard to describe until you're in it. There were mornings that spring where I woke up at 4 a.m. with a stomach full of dread and no specific reason to get out of bed at any particular time. My wife would ask what I was thinking about, and I'd say logistics when what I really meant was everything. The income uncertainty, the health insurance, my son's college applications, whether I was being stubborn or whether I was being smart. Those two things look identical from the inside for a long time before one of them starts to look like the right answer. I'm telling you this because I don't want this to sound like one of those stories where it was easy or inevitable. It wasn't either of those things. There were weeks where I seriously considered taking a regional director role at a competitor just to have something solid under my feet. And I might have, if the Meridian conversation hadn't happened when it did. But here's the thing about building something yourself that you never quite get when you're working inside a structure someone else built. When Bridgeway landed its 5th client, I felt something I hadn't felt in probably a decade. Not relief. Not satisfaction exactly. Something more like recognition, like the work was being seen clearly for the first time, without anyone else's name on top of it. My team now is 7 people. 3 of them worked for me at my old company. They left, not because I asked them to, I was scrupulously careful about that boundary, but because they made their own decisions after watching what happened. They called me. I was honest with them about the risk. 2 of them joined in the first month. 1 waited 8 months and then reached out when a round of layoffs hit. I was glad to have all 3 of them, and I told them so. We are not a huge company. We are not trying to be. We are a firm that does precise, careful, and relationship-driven work in an industry where that approach pays off over time. Every client we have knows they can call me directly. That's not scalable forever, and I know that. But right now, it's what makes us different, and different is worth more than big at this stage. I still drive past the old building sometimes. Not on purpose, it's just on the way to one of our client sites. The parking lot looks different, more empty than I remember it being. I don't feel much when I see it. Maybe a small, quiet thing I don't have a clean word for. Not victory exactly. More like the feeling of having come through something and still being yourself on the other side. That's the part nobody tells you about when you're in the middle of the worst of it. That you can come through something that feels like an ending and find out it was actually just a door. Not a metaphorical door. Not an inspirational poster door. A real, specific door that leads to a real, specific room where different things are possible. I went through that door. The lights were on. The room was smaller than my old one, and quieter, and the furniture wasn't as nice. But the work was mine, and for the first time in a long time, so was the morning.